Everyone, this is what your pastor didn't tell you. Today I am on with Dr. Tom Wadsworth. We're going to be talking about the development of early church services throughout the very early centuries of Christianity, and how we can see a development from what the early church did and taught and enacted compared to what later early church writers did, and how there seems to be a change in how they thought, and we can actually show it in specific quotes for the people that were writing at the time. But this really changes how we view early churches, and this is bringing a lot of interesting attention to the topic. So, how are you doing today, Dr. Wadsworth?
I'm great, Zach. Good to talk to you again.
Yes, yes, absolute pleasure. So we had a previous conversation that'll be added in the description after this video is made. So people can check out that. People can check out your channel where you go into a lot of detail on the topic of worship and what the early church actually did and how they worshiped or lacked thereof exactly there. Yeah, so in our last video, let's talk about just a really quick summary there. Um, could you just talk about just like how you know how early church services today are different than they were in the New Testament in the very earliest church?
Yeah, good question. The My dissertation didn't go to figure out how it's different today from then. My dissertation attempted to go into the New Testament to just to find out how it was then. Let's take the terminology that's used throughout the New Testament to refer to the assembly. Let's also explore this strange worship anomaly that I call it, this
Hmm.
strange odd fact that they don't use worship terminology in the first century like we do today. Today we have worship services. We have an order of worship. We open worship with this. We close worship with that. We have a worship pastor. We have worship songs. We have a worship band. And the worship language just permeates through our entire assembly experience. And then when you look at the New Testament, it's gone. It's not there. And so, what my dissertation attempted to do is figure out why. And I attempted by a two-prong approach. Number one is, well, let's take these Greek words that are usually translated as worship and find out why they would not be used in an assembly context. That was prong number one. And then prong number two was, well, let's go into actual passages in the New Testament that talk about an assembly and find out what words they do use to refer to that assembly, what activities they had in those assemblies, what they were for, what they perceived as the purpose of those assemblies, and then see if we can have a better picture of the why this worship anomaly exists, why they would not use worship terminology. And that's a summary of my approach. I don't know if that's exactly what you're looking for, Zach, but that summarizes.
Okay. All right. And so that's kind of the specific topic of, worship in general. We've talked about some other things about, like pews or leaders like speaking at one specific on a podium or something like that. In our past video. As far as what we'll be talking about today, could you just really quickly give a real quick summary of how we see that development of worship and what we're talking about today?
Yes, in video number 6 in my 7 video series, I go into some detail as to how and when the early church started to develop worship terminology. And when I use the words early church, I'm talking about like the first 4 centuries. Some people, when they use that phrase, they're talking about the first century, and I often am. But now, since we know that they didn't use worship terminology in the first century, well, when did it start and
Hmm.
why? And if I could summarize that in just a minute or two, it'd go like this. I began to notice as I searched through second century Christian literature, third century, and fourth century Christian literature
Hmm.
that the church started to use temple terminology to refer to what they were doing in their gatherings, which was strange because you don't see it in the first century church experience. And it starts with a seed idea that sort of gets planted even around the beginning of the 2nd century. And that is the word sacrifice begins to be applied to the Lord's Supper, which is odd to the Protestant mindset because we tend to think that the Lord's Supper represents Jesus' sacrifice for us. But what we see early on in the 2nd century is that the Lord's Supper is viewed as our sacrifice that we give to God. Now, I know that sounds strange to the Protestant ears, but to Catholic and Orthodox ears, that's right on target for them. But what happens then after that seed idea gets planted is then the table upon which the Lord's Supper sits begins to be viewed as an altar. Because after all, in the Jewish temple and in pagan temples throughout that era of the Greco-Roman world, sacrifices were offered on an altar. It's called an altar of sacrifice, and so that makes sense. Then the third step that happens, and you start to see this in the 3rd century, where the people who preside over the table of the Lord's Supper are no longer just called ministers or Christians or whatever. They're now called priests. Again, this is temple terminology. The Jews used that to refer to the work of priests in the temple. Also, pagans used the term priest to refer to the priests who would offer sacrifices in pagan temples as well. So it was very common terminology in that time. And then the next final crowning achievement of this development of thought happens in the 4th century, when you don't just have the Lord's Supper being a sacrifice, and the table upon which it sits being an altar of sacrifice, and the people who preside over that table being called a priest. The next thing that happens is the building in which all this takes place is now viewed as a temple. And there's a speech by Eusebius in the 4th century, around 320. He is dedicating one of the new Constantinian church buildings at that time, and he calls it a holy temple of God. And he refers to the gathered ministers there as the priests who are donning the sacred robe. So they're not only priests, they're also wearing special garb, which you would see in Judaism, you would see in paganism, but you didn't see this in 1st-century Christianity. And so that's probably too long of an explanation, but once you get these 4 elements together, a sacrifice, an altar, a priest, and a temple, viewed literally, not spiritually or figuratively or metaphorically, then you have latreia in the Greek sense of all the stuff that goes along with the offering of sacrifices.
Okay. So, in the way you've used it, people could probably get an idea, but just for some clarity here, could you define how you're using the word worship? Like, you're not talking about something just like singing songs. You're not, are you talking specifically about sacrifice, like killing an animal? How would you define worship?
Yeah, good question. It is that word that becomes the stumbling block to understanding what we're saying here. In modern English, the English word worship has been evolving, and it's more so now in the last 30 years being used in reference to the singing portion of our assemblies. We have worship music. We have this great worship band. We have a wonderful worship today, and usually they're referring to the singing aspect. In times past, worship would have referred to the prayers as well, or to liturgy of the 18th century or something like that. But anymore, that English word is evolving toward the worship aspect of it. But in the 1st century, we have to look at what the Greek words for worship meant. And as it turns out, none of the 5 Greek words that are translated as worship mean singing. None of them refer to the singing of songs. None of them refer to praying. None of them refer to liturgy. They all refer to different things, these 5 different Greek words. And I can get into the Greek words if you want. It gets to be kind of tedious if you're not academically inclined. But these 5 words are not synonymous. They don't all mean worship. I would contend that none of them means worship in the modern sense. So But the point is, none of these Greek words for worship are ever used in the New Testament to refer to what Christians did in their assemblies. And that's the worship anomaly that needs explaining, and that's what my dissertation attempted to do.
Okay, I just want to make sure people get it. So, could you just give us just really quick, like, what is worship in the New Testament, or the lack thereof?
Okay. Well, when somebody asks me that question, I in order to answer that intelligently and with some clarity, are you asking me about proskuneo worship? Or are you asking me about latreia worship? Or are you asking me about liturgeo worship? Or are you asking me about sebomai worship? Or are you asking me about threskeia worship? Because each one of these
Mm,
words are indeed translated as
yeah,
worship in the New Testament, but they all mean different things.
right.
And
So the
so,
combination of them, because you said there's the Christians aren't doing any of them, right?
true, not in the literal sense, no.
Yeah. So what is the thing specifically that they're not doing that you're claiming that they're not doing?
Well, they're not calling what they're doing worship. And as soon as you call something worship, it brings in a lot of baggage of assumptions that
Mm,
if we're going to get together and worship in a biblical sense, that's going to be it's going to bring along the idea that everything we do must be according to regulations, like in Leviticus 23 or something.
mm-hmm.
This was Old Testament worship, latreia worship, what they were doing in the temple. Everything that was done had to be done according to specific specifications that God ordered in Leviticus and elsewhere in the Torah.
Mm,
But in the New Testament, we have a completely different approach to this. They don't
yeah.
call it worship, they don't call it a service, and they definitely don't call it a worship service. In the New Testament, it's a gathering. And the purpose of that gathering is not to do stuff for God in the New Testament. The purpose of that gathering is to build up one another so that we're all better representatives of God. This is what God wants us to be doing in the assembly. All in spite of the fact that I've preached and many other people have preached from the pulpit that God wants us to be worshipful, and what we're supposed to be doing today is worshiping God
Mm,
because this is what He deserves and what He demands of us. Well, where does the Bible say that is the question.
mm.
And that's where my dissertation got into it deeply.
Okay, that's helpful. So basically, what you're saying, the strict rules of how you should do the worship, the sacrifice, and everything that happens in the temple there, we don't see that in the New Testament, and we don't see that in some of the earliest early church writings. But then all of a sudden we see that later, and then it gets into, like, the church as a temple, and we don't get this idea of one to one. It's more of a one to God kind of thing. Is that a good way to summarize that?
Yeah, I think so. The one to one thing, that's a good thing to point out. One thing you do see in the New Testament, often in reference to assembly activity, is this Greek word allelon, which means one another. And one anothering takes place extensively in Christian assemblies.
Mm,
It's a participatory thing where you're comforting one another, you're teaching one another, you're praying for one another, you're even confessing your sins to one another. James 5:16. You are exhorting one another, praying for one another, forgiving one another. All these things that are one anothering activities where you would not typically think of that going on in the Jewish temple or in a pagan temple as well. But Christianity was something demonstrably new and different and somewhat shocking to
mm,
the culture around it at that time. So much so that they were even accused of being atheists because they didn't have temples and statues and altars. These things were foreign to New Testament Christianity, and the outsiders didn't know what to deal with. How to deal with that? That just seems
yeah.
strange to them. These people must be atheists, they said.
Mm. Yeah, and just to summarize, how we see that change, we see the Lord's Supper later in history becoming a sacrifice when it's not really seen as that before. A um, is that correct? Is that a correct
Mm-hmm.
way to put it? Okay.
Yeah,
Um,
good job.
okay, and then church buildings now a temple. So before it wasn't really seen as a temple, and then, or like what you did in the temple at least, and then of course ministers like the early church ministers were eventually seen as priests, like, the priests of a temple. So yeah, that's obviously a big change there. So let's talk about that. So it seems like the general idea of your argument is that we have no evidence of anyone in the New Testament saying the early churches were to be seen as temples, and then we have evidence of people much later seeing them as temples, and therefore they must have been some shift in thought. So I could see someone looking at this and saying, well, we don't have any evidence earlier, but it's not like we don't have a lot of texts from that early. So maybe we just haven't discovered the evidence. Could you talk about that really quick before we dive into that?
Yeah, we actually have a massive amount of evidence on this. It depends on how. Let's look at the word temple. And anybody can do this. Just go to BibleGateway.com or any one of the, and look up every time the word temple is found in the New Testament. Just look it up. Just see how these Christian writings deal with the concept of temple. And you
Hmm.
find that it is dramatically transformed.
Yeah.
And this is an important theological core understanding that I had missed for centuries, for decades. And that is that in the Old Testament, in Judaism, the temple was seen as the house of God. It's the dwelling place of God on earth. And since it is the dwelling place of God on earth, which is mentioned dozens of times in the Old Testament, then you need to go to that temple where he is, prostrate yourself before him, and offer sacrifices to him in that place. That's where he resides. It's the house of God. All that is biblical terminology to refer to what Jews did in the temple. But now Jesus comes. He predicts the absolute destruction of the temple.
Hmm.
All of Mark 13 is devoted to that. All of Matthew 24, Luke 17, Luke 21. It just goes on. And John refers to it throughout his gospel as well, that the temple's going to be no more. It's all going away, folks. Something's changing dramatically. And the fact is, God no longer dwells in a building.
Hmm.
God now dwells within us. That's the house of God. And therefore, his people are called holy ones, or saints as we see it, the hagioi of the New Testament. Throughout the New Testament, they're referred to as saints. Why would they be called saints and holy ones? Well, because God is in them now. He's not in some building off there somewhere. He's now here. And with that fundamental theological shift, everything changes. Now the focus is on being better people because God is within, and it becomes incumbent upon us to behave ourselves. Holiness becomes a critical attribute of anybody who claims to be a Christian. And another key thing that happens with this change of God dwelling within, when the body of Christ gets together, they also have a holy gathering because God is dwelling within them. Now, the two things in the New Testament that it talks about as being worthy of excommunication is number one, when you violate the temple of God and you commit grave sin, like in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. There's that one guy at Corinth who is he's having sex with his father's wife, with his stepmother probably, and it was just an abomination. And Paul says, send him out of the assembly. He can't be with you anymore. He's violating this fundamental thing. And then the other thing it talks about is a reason why you can excommunicate somebody is in Titus 3, where if somebody is destroying the unity of the body, since that body now of believers is sacred, God dwells within them. Whoever destroys that unity then becomes guilty of a grave sin that they need to be moved out of the assembly. Now, that's what Paul says in Titus 3 and verse 10, I think it is. So anyway, there's much more that could be said about that, but that's a fundamental shift that needs to be understood on this issue of temple.
Yeah, that's a really interesting shift because people on my channel will be familiar with, the Old Testament temple being seen as sacred space. It's a very common idea in the ancient Near East and all these other, Babylonian and Ugaritic contexts or whatever. And then all of a sudden you can't, you have to be pure there. You cannot be defiled, and you've got all these weird laws with that. But then you get in the New Testament, there's nothing like this sacred space for a building. Like that idea is kind of just out of their minds essentially, and that's really interesting to point out that the body is now seen as a temple. So that's really interesting. But it didn't stay that way in church history, at least. Some people changed their minds about that. We're about to get into that. But so on this New Testament, um, let's see here. Yes. So maybe if I don't know if you had anything else to add there, but do we see anything in the New Testament that gives us any strong indication or clear reason to think that the church services or church in general should be seen as some type of temple? I would assume the answer is no, right?
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out a way that the answer would not be no. Um, but the answer is no. I mean, another element that needs to be brought up here that's maybe helpful is this widespread habit of Christians meeting in somebody's house.
Mm-hmm.
House churches are mentioned frequently in the New Testament. It seems to be the standard way that they got together. Now, they obviously didn't view that house as some sacred thing, sacred space that needed to be dressed up with stained glass or tall spires or crosses on the wall or whatever you're going to do. It's, hey, we're going over to Bob's house this week. Are you coming? Um, and if you ever had just a Bible study in somebody's living room someplace, now you're starting to get a feel for what first century assemblies were probably like, at least to some degree. It's this familial feeling and this relaxed, comfortable feeling that we're in somebody's house and there's usually food involved. And that's the agape love feast. That's the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper was a supper. It was an actual meal that they had with their meeting. So, yeah, but put things in a house context, and I think a lot of our minds begin to clear up quickly.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of the litmus test of trying to figure out whether something is appropriate or inappropriate today. Well, does it work in somebody's living room? As if it does, then it might have been purely a first century light type activity. But if it seems totally bizarre to do that in somebody's living room, then probably something's wrong.
Hmm. Okay. And what I want people to keep in mind is we have three developments. Ministers become priests, church buildings now a temple, and Lord's Supper now a sacrifice. So I know that some may argue that the Lord's Supper is seen as a sacrifice. Um, you talked with a few people on faith unaltered or faith altered. I can't remember what the name of it is called. Um, but so like they kind of argue like maybe there was some like vague parallelism going on that maybe you could argue that people could check that out, but you would hold that the Lord's Supper is not a sacrifice, and it's not seen as a sacrifice in the New Testament. So those three things to keep that in mind as we're looking through this. So yeah, let's talk about like what people actually believed in the early church. So could you show us how the early church how that shift occurred? Like, do we have any texts of in the early church of people clearly not thinking the church as a temple, and then all of a sudden we see it as a temple? Like, outline that shift for us.
Well, I think in order to view the gathering as a temple,
Mm-hmm.
you're gonna need to start to view the place where they're meeting as sacred space.
Okay.
Is that where you're going with that question? I think,
Yeah, I'm just outline your argument for that shift. Yeah.
yeah, the they didn't view their buildings as temples. And another fact here is the Greek word for church, ekklesia.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the English word church can be viewed as a building today, there's nobody saying that anytime the word church appears in the New Testament, it's referring to a building. It didn't. It never did in the first century. And that's just an obvious truth if you understand the Greek language and study that thing throughout. Ecclesia is a gathering, it's an assembly. It doesn't refer to a building, but it's our years and years of tradition that have
Mm-hmm.
started to look at it that way, and that's
Okay.
how we got where we are today, I think.
Mm. Okay. And how do we see that in the early church? Like, can you point to like specific early church fathers that you see that shift, or what's important there? What's the evidence for that?
I see. And the thing that threw me there, Zach, when you use the phrase early church, uh,
Yeah. Sorry.
I'm immediately thinking first century,
Yep.
but you may be referring to a wider range, and that's okay. And a lot of people do that. There's nothing wrong with that. We just need to be clear about what we're
Right.
asking about. So the studying church gatherings in the second century, in the third century, in the fourth century, you do see Eusebius, who's writing in the fourth century, referring to back around the persecution around 230. Check that, 250. Let me repeat this. Eusebius is a writer, a Christian writer in the fourth century, who also wrote church history. He wrote the history of the church. It was an astonishing work, and you can buy it today in
Mm-hmm.
English, and it's very illuminating if you start to understand what's going on in there. But he talks about from the apostles through the second century and third and fourth, and he says that in the middle of the third century, during the Decian persecution, Decius was one of the Roman emperors who initiated a rather harsh persecution against Christians around 250. And Eusebius talks about some of the buildings that Christians had built were razed to the ground by Decius. So we know there that Christians did have some buildings in the middle of the third century that were built by Christians for Christian gatherings. But there's very little evidence archaeologically of that today, and I think we're going to talk about that here tonight. But then, what do you do see happening as soon as Constantine declares Christianity a legal religion in 313 A.D., the Edict of Milan? Christianity can now flourish. They can do what they want. They can meet where they want. They can build buildings if they want. But Constantine, being their supporter, and even he's been called a Christian, and he may have been, I'm not sure, but he starts to pour not just imperial funds into the building of magnificent cathedrals. He starts to pour his own funds into supporting this effort. And there are something like 40 different Constantinian churches, church buildings that is, that were built in the Constantinian era from like 315 or 320 on up to, I don't know, 360, 350 around the world. And some of those still exist to this day, like the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, the Church of Holy Wisdom, still exists to this day. I've been there; it's fabulous. But it was first built in that era. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem was one of the Constantinian cathedrals built then. The Church of the St. Peter's Basilica in Rome was also one of those Constantinian buildings that went up in the fourth century. So once those things start going, and of course, when an emperor is going to build a building, he's not going to build like a Morton building, just some barn somewhere. It's going to be lavish. It's going to be prominent in town, and everybody's going to ooh and ah and go nuts with it. And that's exactly what they did in the fourth century. And once you have these magnificent holy buildings, this holy temple of God, as Eusebius refers to it, then you've got all the language of worship that goes along with it, people revering the stuff in there, the furniture, the windows, whatever it is, and they're going to start comparing it to the Old Testament temple. This is exactly what they did in the fourth century.
Very fascinating. Okay. So I just want to show people the quotes for that. So like this is Eusebius. I don't know. 335 CA is what you have on here. Our Savior once more adorned the world with holy temples and consecrated houses of prayer in every city and village, ordaining the erection of churches and sacred buildings to the honor of the supreme God and Lord of all. These hallowed edifices are called churches or houses of the Lord. So this is, way later after the New Testament, 300 years or so. So that's like, the pinnacle of like when you really like they're really seeing like a really high view of the church, right? Um,
Of the church
okay,
building. Yeah.
yeah, church building, correct. Okay, and and um, is there other texts that you know of where earlier that it doesn't look like they have that kind of view of the church,
Oh,
or
yeah.
are you just talking about the New Testament?
No, I'm glad you pulled up this slide. That's from, I think that's episode 6 in my series.
Yes.
I think I have several passages there where I cite Clement of Alexandria, Origen of Alexandria, as well as Minucius Felix, as well as Arnobius. Let's see here. Not that one. It's a
Not
little
that
about
one.
the next one after that, I think. This one kind of works, but go advance one more there.
It's Justin Mortar.
There it is,
Clement of
this one.
Alexandria. Okay.
Clement of Alexandria. He's a bishop of Alexandria, Christian. And
Mm.
he says at this point, 2.462 in one of his writings, he says, the word prohibiting all sacrifices and the building of temples indicates that the Almighty is not contained in anything. Now, I'm not sure where he's coming from here. He's actually indicate that the Bible prohibits sacrifices and the building of temples. And that's why he's actually defending why Christians don't have temples here and why Christians don't have sacrifices. So that's what he says. Go to the next slide.
Yeah, that's really interesting because
Go
it
ahead.
says that the Almighty is not contained in anything, because you have multiple passages in the Old Testament, right, where it seems like God is dwelling in the temple. That's where he dwelled, right?
Yeah, and
Um,
on that point right there, John 4:24, God is spirit, and
mm,
those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. Now, that's the Greek word proskuneo. It's not referring to worship in the modern sense that we would.
mm,
But there, Clement here is referring to the same idea. Almighty is not contained in anything. You know, he is spirit, and being spirit, you just can't put him inside the temple at Mount Gerizim or the temple of Jerusalem.
mm,
He can't be confined. That's Clement's point, and I think that's also Jesus' point in John chapter 4, at least one of his points.
mm. All right, so we have Origin.
Yeah, Origen, he's writing against Celsus here. He's defending Christianity against some criticisms by this writer. He's saying that Christians, we object to building altars, statues, and temples because we've learned from Jesus Christ the true way of serving God. So the attitude, at least of Origen at this point, but he's saying what Christians do, we object to building altars, statues, and temples. This is actually, he goes on a lengthy description for several chapters going into this issue here in this particular writing against Celsus, showing how Christians don't have temples, we don't have statues, we don't have altars. I know Jews do, and I know that pagans do, but we don't do any of that stuff because we've learned from Jesus Christ the true way of serving God. He is our sacrifice. We don't have to offer him anymore. We don't need altars anymore. We don't need temples or statues anymore either. And then I think there
Interesting.
might be one more in this list. Yeah,
Yep.
Arnobius. He's writing around 300. This is interesting. 300.
Yeah.
He's explaining in his document against the heathen. He's defending Christianity against attacks, as so many of these early Christian writers did. He says, we, Christians, do not rear temples. We don't build temples for the ceremonies of worship. We don't set up statues and images of any god. We don't build altars. He's just repeating this common refrain that's also in Minucius Felix, and I don't think I included Minucius Felix in this list. But he says the same thing. We don't do altars. We don't do statues. We don't do temples. And yet today, what do? So I think there's been a shift. That's part of the shift that I'm trying to describe in video number 6 in my series.
Yes, that's very helpful. Okay. All right. So what else do we have on our list here? Yeah. All right. So you also talked about how the ministers or leaders in the early church assemblies eventually started to be seen as priests, just like the priests of the Old Testament. So that maybe you could talk about like the timing of when that happens and the specific evidence we have for that.
Yeah, again, you can do this if you have a good digital copy of all of the ante-Nicene fathers or any collection of early Christian literature.
Yeah.
before Nicaea, which is 325.
Mm.
Look up the word altar. Look up the word priest
Hmm.
every time it's found, which is something I did. And then you're going to see this remarkable development. Early on in the second century, they start to view certain church ministers as special. Even Ignatius tends to refer to the bishop as like God among you.
Hmm.
And you don't see the multiplicity of elders being in charge of a church anymore like you do in the first century. You start to see one person commanding control not just of one church, but of several churches, and that if he's not there when the Lord's Supper is offered, the Lord's Supper is invalid because he's got to be there. So this emphasis on these guys, and then pretty soon they start to take upon themselves the concept of priest, which is your Old Testament concept. And in the era of the second and third centuries, everybody living in those towns, in whether it's Jerusalem or Antioch or Athens or Rome, they all had priests in those communities, usually pagan priests, and they had special status in society. They were revered, they were looked up to. And now Christians started to have the same thing so that these guys get to be revered and looked up to, and you can't do things without the priests anymore. Oh my. So we start to go down a whole different road that actually goes back to Old Testament and starts to leave first century Christian thinking.
Okay. So here is one text worthy of thinking about here. So this is Clement. Okay.
There they go.
Ministers become priests. All right. So you have Clement of Rome. So this is actually pretty early. So I'm interested to hear what you think about this. So he says, the master commanded us to perform at the appointed times the offerings and services. For to the priests, the proper office has been assigned, and upon the Levites, the proper ministries have been imposed. So, I mean, this is like, I mean, maybe not when Paul's still alive, but the apostle to the apostles, they're definitely still alive, right? So, I mean, this is pretty early to see someone like a priest being commanded to do offerings and services. What do you think about that? Doesn't that kind of go against your view there?
No, for a couple of reasons. Number one,
Okay.
on this one, Clement, when he says, for to the priests, the
Mm,
proper office has been assigned, and upon the Levites, the proper ministries have been imposed. He's actually using these terms. If you look at the context, he's talking about the Old Testament priests and the Old
okay.
Testament Levites.
Hmm.
Not that we have priests and we have Levites today, but he's starting to show this tendency to go back into the Old Testament, to grab some concepts and start to apply it to some of this Christian stuff. And in this case, it's the priests. And you do see in Clement of Rome an elevated view of ministers,
Hmm.
and especially of anybody who is descended from an apostle. And so that they start to have special powers and status
Hmm.
that I think is not warranted. Now, you mentioned, does this stuff contradict? Well, I don't know any church on the planet that
Hmm.
regards Clement of Rome as an authoritative document for the Christian church.
Hmm.
I go into a Baptist church, go into a Catholic church, go into an Orthodox church, go anywhere you want. You'll see their Bibles, and you'll see maybe a statement on their website that says, this is what we believe, and we believe the scriptures are inspired, and they are what we go by.
Hmm.
In that list of scriptures is not Clement of Rome. Let's make sure that we understand that.
Yeah.
And so what Clement says doesn't do away with stuff that Paul said, or that Peter said, or that Jesus said. It is stuff, though, that Clement said, and we need to appreciate it in the context in which it was said.
Hmm. Okay. So basically what you're saying, if I could summarize there, is we do see this idea very early. It's still not the biblical text, and it still doesn't necessarily mean that the early Christians did actually think of it this way. But something really important to mention is that we see Clement of Rome looking back at the Old Testament. He's not like looking at the New Testament to make this connection of a command for how we should, lead the church or whatever. He's making some type of argument from the Old Testament some type of what, like typology or parallelism? Is that the idea there of what he's trying to make for
Ty
how we should do it in the future?
Yeah, typology is a good word there. I don't know if anybody's familiar with this term, but typology got to be a big theological problem in the early centuries of the church. This type antitype thing. They started to grab things that were in the Old Testament, like the temple, for example, or the
Mm,
showbread of the holy place, and start to say that Christians now have the antitype of those types. Uh, and that's okay up to a point until it starts to lead you down a path that is not really productive.
yeah, yeah, right. So, I mean, from my perspective, you could tell me what your thoughts are. If we're going back what the biblical text says, like what it explicitly says, not some like vague command that we're reading into the text, then there's no any not even close to any kind of command in the New Testament or even in the Old Testament that the church services, the leaders of services or churches in general should be seen as priests, and certainly not in the same way of like the Levites of offerings and services, right? But so he's making some type of typological argument for something that doesn't seem to have good evidence for. Like there's no even typological argument made in the New Testament, right? So it seems like he's making typological argument based on something that's never even uh, being implied or said that we should be doing. Does that make any sense?
Yes, I get it. He's coming up with new arguments that are not used in the New Testament, that are not used by Jesus and the apostles, but he's starting to develop a new way of thinking, a new way of looking. It's not necessarily bad or wrong until it starts to lead to some dangerous precedents.
Mm,
And I think
yeah.
it goes that way after. That's why I included Clement of Rome here. What his statement is here at 95 AD, it's starting this development of this elevated view
Yeah.
of the ministry team. Is
Yeah.
starting to develop this separation between clergy and laity, where it's the clergy are special, they're the men of God, the rest of us are a bunch of slugs.
Mm,
But in the New Testament, I think you got to go to the word hagioi, which means saints. Everybody's a saint. Everybody is a holy one in the Christian system because God
mm,
dwells in them, in everybody who is a Christian, been given the Holy Spirit. It doesn't just dwell in those leaders. That's false thinking. That's not New Testament thinking. It
mm.
dwells in everybody. And now that we all have been given the gifts of the Spirit and they've been distributed to everybody in the Spirit, and so that the body can work together, acknowledging that everybody's got something to offer.
Yeah, and I think the important thing to mention here is that he's not saying the early apostles said, "Hey, you should run church this way," or the early apostles said, "Hey, priests should do this." He's saying he's like making some argument from the Old Testament when there's no command or even it's not even implied from New Testament that that should be continued. Like just because the Old Testament Israelites did that doesn't necessarily have any implication on how we should do it today, right? So that it's like even if it was early, it's clearly not reasoning we should follow.
Again, right,
I
right.
think that's a good way to put it.
Let me add
Um,
one thing there,
sure.
Zach. I think the net effect of this line of thinking is to, like when Clement said that, and when Irenaeus says stuff like that, when Ignatius says stuff like that, the net effect of him making these statements that these people are priests, that they're special,
Hmm.
it elevates them. They become more important. They become critically important to the church. They begin looked up at, and everybody else gets to be looked down at. They're just regular folk that don't really count. So when you see this idea developing, ask Clement, "Oh, Clement, what do you got to gain by saying this? I mean, what are you doing here?"
Mm,
Well, he's making himself really, really important when I think biblically, he does not have grounds to do that. In Jesus talks about whoever would be first among you must be your servant. Whoever would lead has got to follow. This is Christian leadership. You don't lord it over other people. You're not more important than anybody else, but we're all in this together, and we need to have this one anothering kind of attitude when we get together.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard a number of scholars argue that Clement was, and this might be a bit of a argument from silence, but it seems really eerily coincidental that we see this first idea of elevated church leaders at the same time when he's dealing with a bunch of conflict in the church, and he coincidentally needs an argument to have leaders that he obviously wants in control to be in control of the other leaders that are in conflict. Just an interesting coincidence there. An interesting video similar on the topic is my video with Stephen Nimish on apostolic succession, however you pronounce that. But yeah, we can keep going unless you don't have anything, unless you have something to add there.
No, I'm good.
Okay. All right. Next interesting quote here we have Ignatius. So I think you mentioned this. Only that Eucharist, which is under the authority of the bishop or whomever he himself designate, is to be considered valid. This is a letter to the Spurians. So I think that a lot of scholars, or at least some scholars, argue that this is written actually much later, not Ignatius. But even if it is Ignatius, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I tend to think it is Ignatius. I don't think it's a later that it could be. I don't think Ignatius uses the term priest in reference to himself or ministers, but you can see that it's starting here. Only that Eucharist, which is under the authority of the bishop, is considered valid. Again, it's an elevation of these guys, and it's essentially a demotion of everybody else. And they say you can't even do certain things if the bishop is not here. You don't see that idea in the New Testament,
Right.
at all. So yeah, that's what's going on here. I think Ignatius has been known for a long time to be sort of the starting point of this whole bishop idea, that there's one guy who's in charge not just of one church but of many. Yeah, there you see it.
Interesting. All right, and then we have Irenaeus. He's written in around 190, and all the apostles of the Lord are priests who do inherit here neither lands nor houses, but serve God on the altar continually. So you see priests being connected to the altar. Is there any other things worth mentioning here?
Yes, here, as I recall, Irenaeus does not refer to the ministers as priests, but he refers to the apostles of the Lord as priests. You know, like the 12 apostles in the first century. They're priests. Okay, well, yeah, all right. But the seed is now being planted here with Irenaeus, as with Ignatius earlier, that pretty soon anybody who's going to be in the role of a minister is going to be viewed as a special priest who serve God and the altar. So the altar's coming in here. That kind of language is also being used. Irenaeus definitely views the Lord's Supper as a sacrifice, and that becomes problematic.
Yeah, it's really interesting how that altar language. We don't see anything like that in the New Testament, right?
The word altar is used once in reference to Christians, and that's in Hebrews 13, verse 10, where the writer says, "We have an altar." But he's not referring to that we have an actual physical altar where we offer sacrifices, but he's referring to, I think he's referring to Jesus there, because he is our sacrifice for our sins. And the writer of Hebrews, his point throughout the entirety of that epistle is that Jesus is the once for all sacrifice, so that no further sacrifices need be made, because he was that one altar, that one sacrifice that took care of our sins. We don't need to continually be offering sacrifices on an altar anymore. That's
Gotcha.
the writer's point there.
All right. And then we have Tertullian. Their ordinations are carelessly administered, capricious, changeable. At one time they put novices in the office, for even on laymen do they impose the duties of priesthood. So that's Tertullian. What is the significance of this one?
Yeah, here do you see a blatant use of the word priest or priesthood in reference to the church leadership. And the separation also between laymen and clergy. Tertullian is definitely into this, writing from Carthage in North Africa at around the turn of into the 3rd century. Definitely is into that, and he's upset that people who shouldn't be priests are being made priests, and this is a problem.
Hmm. And then we have Cyprian. So he says, "Yet I hear that certain presbyters, neither mindful of the gospel nor giving the bishop the honor of his priesthood and of his dignity, are already communicating with the lapsed and giving them the Eucharist." So yeah, clear priesthood, Eucharist, bishop. What are thoughts on that one? Same thing.
To read further into Cyprian, he of all these writers in the 2nd and 3rd century, he begins to use priest terminology much more extensively than anybody else to refer to the ministers and viewing them as very special. But even then, he's still not using the worship term to refer to what they did in their assemblies, although the idea is getting fairly well entrenched by that point. But then finally, worship terminology gets to be used by the 4th century.
Interesting. Okay. All right, and the Eusebius, friends, priests of God, and ye who are clad in the sacred gown adorned with the celestial crown of glory.
Yeah, I was referring to this earlier. Eusebius himself, who is giving this speech that's found in chapter 10 of his church history, he is dedicating one of these new Constantinian temples, Constantinian cathedrals, churches at that time, and he calls out the priests who are in the audience. Ye who are clad in the sacred gown. Oh my goodness. So they're not just regular folks. They've got a gown. And it's not just a gown, it's a sacred gown that only they can wear. So this idea is getting thoroughly entrenched now by the 4th century.
Yeah, that's really interesting that we don't see anything like that. It seems to me at this point, the only arguments you can make for something like this is either that God like led the church in its development and that's what he wanted, or that like apostolic succession where like even though we don't have any writings of it, even though it's not in the New Testament, it was carried by the apostles by tradition. And that's a whole nother topic that you can check out my video on. That'll be in the description. And then 380, the bishop is the mediator between God and you in the several parts of your divine worship. He is, next after God, your earthly God.
Wow. And here, finally, the bishop and these priests are being crowned as your earthly God.
Oh, my goodness.
Goodness. It's really, and the Apostolic Constitution's probably written toward the end of the 4th century, are so deeply steeped in this. And I think the thing that it enhanced and accelerated the use of all this temple terminology was the building of sacred buildings. And once you get that going and everybody's meeting in these magnificent structures every week, priorities start to get out of whack.
I see. Interesting. Fascinating. That's pretty wild. Okay. So let's see. What else do we have now? Okay. So I find this really interesting in regards to the discussion of men and women. You can add your thoughts if you want. There's not much to add probably though. So Sandra Glan, who I've interviewed on the channel, she talked about how so she argues that women should be allowed to serve as pastors in churches, and she argues that one of the reasons why we don't see as many women in the church serve as a priests or bishops, even though there are definitely some, it is because there was a shift away from the priesthood of believers, which is in 1 Peter 2:9, where believers, all of us are seen as priests, which there's a shift from that to an all-male priesthood, which is patterned after the Old Testament, because in the Old Testament they only had male priests, And then the church looked to the past rather than the future kingdom in its view of the telos of men and women. So I just find that a really interesting explanation that it parallels really well with what you're talking about here. Additionally, so I'm not sure how much research you've done on this topic here, but I find it interesting that women were stopped from serving in the early church because of similar reasons for like why women couldn't serve in the temple, because the church was seen as a temple, and therefore it makes sense that we need to incorporate the old laws from the Old Testament into these new laws, because you have the idea of like the temple is sacred and all that. So Carolyn Osick and Kevin Madigan, they say the motive of blood as the uncleanliness unworthy of the purity of the altar, as expressed by Matthew Blastaris, was one of the most common reasons given for the exclusion of women from the altar service. And Matthew Blastaris, so it is a 14th century text, but we see it all over the place in early church history. He says that women deacons then fulfilled a certain service among the clergy, which is nearly unknown to everyone now. There are some who say that they baptized women because it was not proper for men to see undressed those being baptized who were of a certain age. Others say that they were allowed to approach the holy altar and perform nearly all the functions done by male deacons. They were forbidden access and performance of these services by later fathers because of their monthly flow that cannot be controlled, which is a direct parallel from what happens in the Old Testament for why they're stopped from serving. And then there's other people that could be cited there. It's okay if you don't have anything to add. Did you have anything to add there?
Yeah, let me add something there.
Okay.
One thing that's surprised me when I was doing my work on these Greek words for worship was trying to figure out what proskuneo meant. And I noticed this passage in Deuteronomy 16:16,
Okay.
which set everything in place for me. This verse was a real light bulb for me. There God is speaking, and he commands all male Jews. By the way, that's important right there. All male Jews, that they needed to come to the temple 3 times a year, and that's where they present themselves to the Lord by prostrating.
Yeah.
That's proskuneo. And then they must not come empty-handed, which is the sacrificing. But the one thing I want to point out here now about that verse is that it's male Jews. Females were not allowed in several parts of the temple. Yes, when the temple got built by Herod, they did have the court of women, but that's on the outside. That's just where anybody, the court of the Gentiles. I mean, Gentiles can go there too, as along with the women. But so the women, even there in the Old Testament system, were banished to outside of places where men could go. But this is not Christian thinking. This is Jewish thinking from Old Testament temple terminology and thinking. So in that sense, I see where those writers are coming from and explaining how women eventually got excluded in later developments of the Christian church in the 2nd and 3rd and 4th centuries. I would have to look closer at it though. But I think but what still everybody has to deal with, including those fine female scholars who have done that work, is 1 Timothy 2 and 1 Corinthians 14, which are rather explicit about women keeping silent in the assembly and women not having authority over man. Those passages need study. And no matter how you're going to explain women's freedom, you have to deal with those verses. I'm not saying they can't be dealt with. They're not impenetrable. But if you want to get into that, we can. But I'll let those ladies go ahead and go after that issue. I would, by the way, if I'm going to have a Christian gathering, an assembly, an ecclesia meet in my home, I'm not only going to allow women to speak, I'm going to encourage women to speak. Just this fundamental principle of the New Testament that the Spirit has been given to everybody and that we're all one in Christ. There's no neither male nor female in Christ. I need to hear what the females are thinking as well as the males. And I think what has happened over the years of us pressing the complementarian viewpoint is church discussions have become much too laden with testosterone and not enough of the kinder, gentler female approach that they could be bringing to a discussion. But we've
Yeah.
shut ourselves off from that, and I think that's a problem.
Right. Yeah. So you're not even making an argument or even making a claim right now necessarily on that discussion of whether should be pastors or leaders in the church or whatever. You're simply just saying, hey, we need to incorporate their opinions and thoughts, and we need to encourage them to do that. And yeah, I'm totally with that. So
Well,
yeah, people.
let me add one thing there. Okay.
Sure.
Zach, this topic is really divisive and it's difficult. And there
Sure.
are people, honest, good, conscientious, spirit-filled, spirit-driven Christians who have come to different points of view. And I am against anybody who wants to try to create some division inside their church over this issue.
Hmm.
Unity is much more important. Jesus emphasized it so strongly in John 17, and the apostles and Peter and James and John emphasized unity so strongly. We've got to be looking at unity as the goal here. But at the same time, yeah, I think my gut instinct of how I'm dealing with those scriptures would lead me to not silencing women at all, but allowing them to speak. And if it come, I don't see anything inherently within a female that prevents them from being in leadership. I mean, they have that ability. I mean, we've got a female running for president today, and we're going to have more in the future, and we've had some in the past. They aren't disqualified just because they're female. They have enormous talents to bring to the table, and it seems that the church suffers when we don't even allow them to come to the table.
I see. All right. So there was something else that I wanted to talk about. We never really got into it, so forgive me for not having it in the notes there, which was, let's see here. Yes, sacrifices and the Eucharist. So the Lord's Supper becomes the Eucharist. So I don't want to spend too much time, unless you feel like you have to. I think these slides might be a little messed up, so that's really awkward. Okay, let's try this again. Yeah, all right. So could you outline that for us, the conversation between the Eucharist as a sacrifice? So how does that work? Like, is there a certain logic that they give for that? Of like why the Eucharist becomes a sacrifice? Was it always seen as a sacrifice, or I guess Passover in general?
Yeah, I've had conversations with several Catholics as well as Orthodox, and that's where you would see this thinking being most prevalent in Christendom today. They often point to 1 Corinthians 10 as they see that the Lord's Supper is being referred to as a sacrifice there. I don't see it at all, but let's say that's fine.
Okay.
I'm not, but let's say it's fine to view the Lord's Supper as a sacrifice. The
Okay.
danger of this happens when you get to where Irenaeus was toward the end of the 2nd century, when he viewed taking the Lord's Supper as something you need to do in order to be forgiven. In other words, there's not just Jesus' sacrifice, which was a once-for-all sacrifice, really isn't once for all. It's something that has to be repeated time and time and time again. We got to make this offering of a sacrifice, the Lord's Supper, every week in order to receive forgiveness. It seems that approach negates or turns completely ineffective this work of Jesus on the cross to die as the sacrifice for our sin. And yeah, you brought up the right passage here from Irenaeus. He says, we make an offering to God of the bread and the cup of blessing. And then when we have perfected the offering, however the perfection took place, we invoke the Holy Spirit that the receivers of these antitypes may obtain remission of sins and life eternal. This line of thinking does exist in a broad swath of Christianity to this day, but it comes from this line of thinking. I think it's dangerous. I think it's theologically problematic, to say the least, because it tends to deny the efficacy of the sacrifice of Jesus. But if somebody says that, no, no, I'm not denying the efficacy of the sacrifice of Jesus. No, 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 I don't think I got to take the Lord's Supper in order to be forgiven every week, but I still think it's a sacrifice. I say, okay, let's go on. That's
Okay.
fine.
All right. But I did want to talk about the very first mention. So, very first mentions of this idea of the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, the bread and the wine as a sacrifice is Justin Martyr. So that's actually pretty late, 160. That's, that's 100 years after a lot of the New Testament documents.
Hmm.
And so Justin says, God then speaks of those Gentiles, namely us, who in every place offer sacrifices to him, the bread of the Eucharist, and also the cup of the Eucharist. So it seems like he's saying this is the first mention, pretty clear mention that Eucharist is a sacrifice. And what is the relevance to Malachi 1:11 here?
Yeah, it's actually quite fairly important. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to describe it. It's the reference to the Gentiles here. In second and third century Christian literature, Malachi 1:11 got to be referred to a number of times as evidence in the Old Testament that predicted the coming of the Gentiles. And
Hmm.
Malachi 1:11 says what it says there, "My name shall be great among the nations being Gentiles, and in every place frankincense will be offered to my name." Now, in Malachi 1, I don't think it's referring to the Lord's Supper there at all. It's actually talking about frankincense. And you see these frequent references in Old Testament prophets to the idea that the nations will come and bow before Jesus and they'll offer sacrifice or bow before God, and they will also come and offer sacrifices to the God of Israel. And that's what's going on in Malachi 1. I don't think Malachi 1 is talking about Christianity in that sense here, but that's why Malachi 1 is mentioned here.
Hmm.
Um, yeah.
Okay. So is he arguing that Malachi 1 11 is saying that future people will sacrifice with the Eucharist, or how is he connecting those dots?
Yes, that's correct. And you see it up above. God then speaks of those Gentiles, and what he's referring to there is Malachi 1.
Hmm.
And by the word nations and Gentiles are both ethnoi. It's the same Greek word
Yeah.
in both cases, and that's why we get a little bit confused looking at this here. But that's what Justin was doing, referring to God speaking of the Gentiles in Malachi 1, or offering sacrifices, but actually they're offering frankincense offered to his name. But Justin Martyr reinterprets all that as referring to the bread of the Eucharist and the cup of the Eucharist, which is a stretch, but okay.
So basically, what you're saying is he's taking Malachi out of context to essentially justify his position about the sacrifices and bread and the Eucharist.
Yes.
Fascinating. All right, and I think the important thing there is even if you want to say this is an early text, we can see at least a this is a justification for why someone would believe this in the earliest time, and this might even explain why in later time periods we have this belief, even if they later times wouldn't even use the same justification.
Yeah.
So maybe we even have like a justification for the origin of this line of thinking. But all right, so Acts of Peter 2:2. So this is the end of the second century, and they brought bread and water to Paul for the sacrifice so he could distribute to all. Rufina wanted to receive the Eucharist from Paul, but Paul said to her, Rufina, you are not coming to the altar of God in truth.
Yeah, let me explain. This is the Acts of Peter. This is in a different category of early Christian literature called
Yeah.
the New Testament Apocrypha. This is, it's called the Acts of Peter. It purports to be the Acts of the Apostle Peter, but nobody thought that it really was the Acts of Peter. He actually comes up with this strange story about Paul. They bringing bread and water to Paul for the sacrifice so that he could distribute to all. And when they talk about the sacrifice being distributed, they're talking about the Eucharist, as he explains in the next sentence. But Paul says, Rufina, you're not coming to the altar of God in truth. So this is probably written around the late second century, where these ideas of the Lord's Supper being a sacrifice and the sacrifice sitting on an altar are fairly well entrenched even by that
Yeah.
time. If indeed 185 is an accurate date for this particular writing, that's really
Yeah.
tough to date this one. We don't have too many copies of the Acts of Peter.
Right. So, so we don't have any like justification for why they would think this, but it's a testimony that people certainly thought at the time period. And then Irenaeus. So you kind of talked about that. Was there anything else you wanted to add there?
No, this
Okay.
is one place where it's really clear.
Okay. And then the Lord's Passion is the sacrifice we offer. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you shall show forth the Lord's death until he comes. Anything to add there?
No, the last three lines there are right on target with what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11, is what Jesus says in the Gospels. But the idea that the Lord's Passion is the sacrifice that we offer, that's a little different than what you read in the New Testament.
Yeah. All right. And all right, so you conclude by the late second century, Christians increasingly viewed the Lord's Supper as our sacrifice given to God, even though we don't see that in the New Testament. Is what you argue at least.
Yeah, let me add something there,
Okay.
Zach. Those folks who are Reformation scholars who study the Protestant Reformation of the 1500s and 1600s, they will know that the idea that the Lord's Supper was a sacrifice was directly attacked by these early Protestant leaders. For example, Zwingli. Zwingli, Luther had his 95 Theses pounded to the door of the Castle Church at Wittenberg. Zwingli also has his own 67 Theses that he also puts forth. And one of his theses is that the Mass, that is the Lord's Supper, is not a sacrifice. Those are the expressed words that he uses in part of his theses, which were written in 1521, I think. But Luther also gets involved with this as well. So you're right. This whole idea that the Lord's Supper is our sacrifice is wrong, and we disagree with that. And there were several other of the Protestant leaders of that era who targeted that specific theological idea as an errant one that had crept into the church over the years, and it needed to be rooted out.
I see. Okay. And there's one other key set of quotes that you mentioned in your presentation I wanted to get to, uh, assuming that you have time to keep going.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. And this is the big one, the building becomes a temple. So I don't know how much time you think is worth spending on this one, but yeah, so Hippolytus, the God-fearing man, should consider it a great loss if he does not go to the place where they give instruction. If a teacher is there, let none of you be late in arriving at the assembly at the place where they give instruction. So what's the significance for this one?
Yeah, it's this first time you see a reference to a special place where Christians go where they receive instruction.
Hmm.
It's not talking about a house. It's talking to probably it's a place where they give instruction. It's sort of an instruction house. They wouldn't have called it a house of worship yet, but there's a special place that's but this is 220 A.D. and I thought this was interesting when I saw this in Hippolytus's writing that this reference to these assemblies at this special place. So it
Yeah.
doesn't seem to be a sacred place yet, but it is a space nonetheless.
Fascinating. All right. And we have Dura Europus, which we'll talk about in just a second. Was there anything you wanted to add here?
No, if we're going to talk about it in a minute, maybe I'll save my breath for that.
Okay, all right, sounds good. All right.
But notice the date. That's what's important here, 240. And this is right after the place where they give instruction. And this is, by the way, Hippolytus is writing from Rome. Dira Europos is in Syria, hundreds and hundreds of miles away, different culture altogether. But these kinds of ideas and activities are starting to get developed.
Fascinating. All right, and then 298. Oh, there we go. The Aqaba Church in Jordan is the world's oldest known purpose-built Christian church.
Yeah, the two important words here are purpose-built. Dura Europos is not a purpose-built Christian building.
Hmm.
It is a renovated house into a building that was used perhaps exclusively for Christian gatherings. But in Aqaba, in modern day Jordan, they've uncovered the ruins you see there on your screen, that they think that this is the world's oldest known purpose-built Christian church. And that's 298. We're coming up on 300. So
Wow.
maybe one additional point I can make here. You know, a lot of people have said to me, Tom, the reason they met in homes was because they're persecuted.
Yep.
They couldn't build churches. Well, in 298, they were still being persecuted. Back in Dura Europos, they were being persecuted then. In the place where they give instruction in Rome with Hippolytus in 220, they're still being persecuted. But the truth of persecution is persecution was sporadic. And sometimes it was heated and sometimes it was rather light. And when there would come a new emperor into power in the Roman Empire, sometimes they'd have, I don't care what the Christians do, they're fine. Or there would be some that says, let's go get them, let's kill them, let's burn them. And then they would wipe them out. So you can't just say just because of persecution there were no church buildings. Well, they did have some. Persecution was here or there and occasional. It's not universal all the time. And thus they did build buildings eventually, but it's almost 300 years after the gospel is preached by Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah. That was one of the comments that I received on a number of that video that we last did, that, it's, there's lots of persecution. That's why they're in homes. That's why they acted like this. That's why they didn't do other things. But it seems like a good argument against that idea is that, hey, it was sporadic. Sometimes there was a lot of persecution, sometimes there wasn't. And there wasn't when in the times where there wasn't persecution, we don't just see this outgrowth of, big public churches.
Yeah, let me hang on. Do you ever have somebody reach back into their library and say, I want to talk about this? This book,
Okay.
let me see if you get it.
There you go.
There we go. Christian Persecution in Antiquity. This just came out a couple of years ago by Wolfram Kinzig. He wrote it in German originally. It was translated into English. It's a very good work. But what he does in this book, he studies in great detail persecutions from the first century on, and asks the question, okay, what exactly kind of persecution is going on? Is this kill 'em persecution, or is this just injure 'em persecution? Is it just shut 'em up persecution, or what kind of persecution is it? How hot and heavy is it? Are there places where it lightens up and gets harder and harder later on? So, and his conclusion is what I just said, is that persecution in the early church is sporadic, and at times it's more intense than others. But just to say that it's all the time, nonstop persecution, that's not it's not correct. It's just not historically correct.
Right. Yeah. So I appreciate that extra thoughts there. So to conclude, there was two things I want to talk about: Dura Europos and supposedly Peter's house. So let's see if I can. You kind of already had that in the slide. So this is Dura Europos, which is a very what would you say is the earliest church that we know of?
This it's the earliest known archaeological remains of what appears to have been a gathering place for Christians. And they can tell by looking at this thing. They actually can date it. It goes to 251 or something, somewhere right around there. And it's in modern-day Syria where these ruins are found. And it appears that this used to be an actual residence that was converted for use as a Christian gathering place. So that's what the significance of that. You don't see Christian church buildings found anywhere earlier than that. Quick story. Just a month ago, my wife and I were in Turkey, where we went to the 7 churches of Revelation. you know. And in Revelation 2 and Revelation 3, John writes to Smyrna and Philadelphia and Ephesus and Pergamum. Uh, and so we wanted to go to these sites. Well, by some others in our tour group thought that when they were going to see the churches of Asia, the churches of Revelation, that we were going to see church buildings. No, there's no church buildings there. No, the churches are ecclesia.
It's awesome.
They're gathering places. They're in somebody's home in these locations. There are no ruins of a church building in these sites, and if there are, they're from like the 5th century or the 4th century. They're not from the 1st century. They didn't have church buildings in the 1st century. So get it out of your head. Nobody's thought that. So yeah, I'm sorry to stress that point, but
Yeah.
by the way, going to these ruins is a fabulous experience. It was great to walk among them and walk in the footsteps of Paul and Peter and John, particularly. He's in this area, and to get an experience, get a feel for what Revelation is all about as well.
Right.
But we don't
Yeah.
need to go down there.
Yeah. This site has been cited for some type of argument that some have cited that this is like evidence against your position. Could you talk about why some people might think that? We could pull up that article that we have that you said that seems to be a little off, or a little not actually what the evidence is saying. But yeah, could you talk about like how maybe people might confuse this as contradicting your argument?
Yeah, frankly, I don't see how in the world it contradicts what I'm saying. First off, my research was in 1st century church, 1st century assemblies. Um, Dura Europos is a 3rd century building. And I have no problem acknowledging and admitting and affirming that, yes, there at Dura Europos, this place in Syria, they had converted a house into a Christian gathering place. That doesn't conflict with anything I'm saying about 1st century Christianity. They're talking about a different era.
Yeah.
And things happened. Things evolve as time goes by. And certainly by that time, in that spot of the world, they had started to convert houses into assembly places.
Okay. Yeah. So it seems to me that uh, like one of these articles says, let's see here, that maybe I can't figure out the quote, but yeah. So like, yeah, basically what you're saying is, whatever happened later doesn't have anything to do with what happens in the 1st century. So that fits just along the lines of what you talked about of the culture was shifting. Just because we have evidence of a church being seen as something later doesn't mean it has anything to do with what they did early necessarily.
Yeah.
So let me see here if there's anything else worth mentioning on that.
Well, while you're looking, I can add
Yeah.
one thing there.
Okay.
We don't know from looking at this pile of rocks there, Dura Europos,
Yeah.
the degree to which they viewed this space as sacred space. Um, did they view it like we would view a church building? Did they view it as a house of worship, as we tend to do today? We're just looking at a pile of dirt and rocks and trying to figure out what it means. And the same kind of problems that occur with biblical interpretation also happens in terms of archaeological interpretation. What I'm saying here is we don't want to be looking at the evidence, whether it's an evidence of a pile of dirt and rocks or at the evidence of the words of Scripture, and force modern ideas into that evidence. And that's sometimes done with archaeology as well. When you just assume that they had certain things, then you're going to see things that aren't really there in the evidence. So just as that as a word of caution when looking at archaeological
Yeah.
finds and what they mean.
Yeah. Right. So it seems like someone of the someone that's contradicting that wants to say that, hey, the early church, like the earliest church, they did these house churches and they worshipped in them, and they would point to this because this is evidence of a house church and people possibly worshiping. It seems like it would be, at least, but um, the problem of this, of course, is that's much later. One scholar on this topic, Sessa, she says, or is maybe the guy, I don't know. Says, scholars concur that Christians of the first and early second centuries worshipped in their houses without carrying any material changes, for there is no archaeological or literary evidence to suggest physical alteration. So um, that maybe that'll contradict what you're saying. So she's saying that, or she or he is saying that they did worship earlier than that, but they just didn't make changes that we can detect. Um, so um,
Well,
Maybe what she means by worship is just general church service.
there you go.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yes, and because this terminology is flooding our thinking. Even scholars have written books, and I've got 20 of them behind me here,
Yeah.
of scholars writing books about New Testament worship. And what those books are about is the way Christians did their assemblies in the first century. But they all seem to ignore the fact that they never called it worship. And that's when go back to where we were an hour and a half ago
Yeah.
in this
Yeah. Right.
discussion,
Right.
which I think we need to take a strong look at the language that they used in the first century to have a better look at that. But that's a
Fascinating.
separate point than
Yeah.
all this archaeological
Right.
discussion.
Right. All right. So here's another one that I just find the archaeological discussion really fun. So this is supposedly Peter's house, and at the end of the late first century. This is cited in an article. Who cited that? Was it Rittmeyer? I think it was Rittmeyer. Um, but like, what do we know about this Peter's house location in Capernaum? So like, is this actually Peter's house? There, people can check the article by Rittmeyer, but he talks about how there was changes that occurred to the house. How does this play into the discussion?
Yeah, I've actually been there to Peter's house, the alleged Peter's house in Capernaum. As I recall, there at Capernaum, they've built sort of a viewing building on top of these ruins, and the building has a glass floor where you can sit up there in this building and look down and see these ancient ruins, which is really
Wow.
kind of cool.
Yeah.
But again, and the reason they think it might be Peter's house is there's some inscriptions on the walls in there uh, where it seems that in later years people got to regarding this place as the place where Peter lived,
Hmm.
and that there's evidence, as I recall, of 5th century them converting this apparent or alleged home of Peter into a church building, into a cathedral, to a holy space. Um, so again, when you're studying piles of rocks,
Hmm.
like they're doing at Peter's house, if indeed it's Peter's house, you need to ask several questions. Is uh, is this rock from the first century, or is this rock from the 4th century that somebody built on top of the first century rock? And what are, but because they know there was in the 5th century, I think, a definite cathedral of sorts that was built on top of what
Hmm.
was thought to be Peter's house. Another angle here, Zach, that's got to be remembered with stuff like this is marketing.
Hmm.
Um, for example, now just last month when we were in Turkey, we also flew over to Antioch and to Tarsus, where Paul was from Tarsus, and Antioch's where the Christians were first called Christians. Well, there in Antioch, there is the cave church of St. Peter. Did you know that the cave church of St. Peter is there in Antioch? Well, I was there. And really, what happened here is at some point later on in history, somebody found a cave. They found a hole in the side of a mountain.
Hmm.
And they thought, oh, I bet Peter worshiped here. And they turned this into the cave church of St. Peter, and they've got pictures of Peter there, and they got this big long altar inside this cave now, and it's been lavishly added onto over the centuries, and it becomes this tourist site, and you got to
Yep.
pay, $10, which is 1,400 Turkish lira or something, in order to get in. So, and same thing's true with Jerusalem or any place. They've learned, and they're right, that if you find something that seems to have some sort of significance to a religion,
Yep.
whether it's Christianity or Judaism or whatever, you can start to charge people to go in, and you can make millions off of these places, and drive tourism not just for a year or two, but for decades, or if not centuries, and it become an
Yeah.
amazing thing. So that doesn't, not to say to you therefore throw away all this thinking about these places, but that really needs to be studied very closely with responsible people who know what they're doing, who can distinguish one rock from another, and make some good
Yeah.
conclusions as to what they're looking at.
Right, right, right. Okay. So I appreciate that explanation there. So, in this article by Rittmeyer that I wanted to mention, so he, or I would assume, so Rittmeyer's an actual archaeologist. Like I looked him up. He seems like he's pretty prestigious. I couldn't find any like articles on this topic that are making the same claims, but it seems like what they're saying is that there was, let's see here if I can find a good picture of it. Um, the room that they're talking about, I guess it's this one right here. Yeah, that it has like layers to it. So at the bottom layer, there is like just normal like pottery and stuff like that. And then the top layer or the higher layer, it's got all this stuff going on in the room that make people think that, hey, there must have been worship that's going on. So let me see if I can find out where he talks about this. Um, yeah, so several layers of plaster were found on the walls and on the floor. And apparently, plaster is known for being some type of worship scenario. Quite unusually, this is the only room in Capernaum that was plastered. So, like, it's not normal for a house to be like this. So it must have been used for non-domestic purposes. There was a change in pottery. So, like, instead of domestic vessels, cooking pots, bowls, juglets found. Above the plastered floor, however, only storage jars and oil lamps were discovered. And storage jars and oil, that's pretty stereotypical of worship, right? So
Is it?
basically, what'd you say?
Yeah, is it? That's a big question there. Could they
You
use
tell
oil
me.
for lamps? I mean, oil lamps were really common back then. What? I got this one when we were in Rome. This is an oil lamp. It's even got an ichthus on there.
Mm,
Uh, so this was really common in the first century too. This isn't evidence of. It's evidence that they like to have light in a room. I
okay.
don't. So I so. I, but I'm not an archaeologist, so let me step back and just acknowledge my own lack of expertise in this field.
Mm,
But we got to be really careful with what we're looking at.
yeah. Yeah. Well, of course, pottery in general, like pottery is everywhere, right?
Yeah,
So there's nothing completely special about pottery. There, let's see. Um,
the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in pottery, in
sure.
pots.
Right.
So,
Sure.
and that's dates to the first century, and we know that. So even pottery, well, pottery goes back a whole lot longer than that too. So let's just be really careful about what conclusions we're coming to from what little evidence we have.
Hmm. Yeah. What about the plaster? I mean, I don't know anything about plaster. Do you know anything about that in your research? That why would so like one reason I don't even understand why plaster would be connected to worship. Do you know anything about that?
I don't know anything about that.
Okay.
I begin to question it though immediately. Just be aware of, there's tremendous motivation for people to write these articles and not have the purest of motives in mind. Uh, So it just needs to be studied closely to make sure we know what's being said here and we're coming to reasonable conclusions based on the evidence that is at hand.
Yeah, I see. And of course, so do you, of your research, this seems, all this stuff we're talking about here seems to be first century, though, right? Like
No, no,
this plaster.
I don't think so, but I've been there to Peter's house. So
Oh,
there's evidence that they know that comes from the 5th century in the
yeah.
house as well. I mean, it's not as though Peter had this house in the 1st century and then at 90 AD they didn't touch it until today.
Mhm.
Not true. Especially since they thought this was Peter's house, it got really a great deal of attention. And as was typical at this time, they would eventually become holy sites, and you could charge people admission because it's a holy site. And remember,
Mhm.
Constantine, when he becomes a Christian and he makes Christianity legal in 313 AD, he sends Helena, his mother,
Mhm.
from Istanbul down to Jerusalem to go find Christian sites. And Helena's the one who determined that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre should be built there because that's where Jesus was buried. It was Constantine's ma who figured this out. And at least that's what she wanted. And it's been determined she's just, she was a very devoted Christian, but she's not an archaeologist. But they just wanted to have all these Christian sites made holy, and that's when the idea of the Holy Land got going because of Helena, and all the sacred stuff starts to be applied to all these things in the Constantinian era, and we're still the recipients of that stuff today.
Mhm. I see. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on here. So obviously there was a lot more other things that happened in church history that really changed how we do church today.
Yeah.
I was just curious, was there anything else you wanted to add there? That, I mean, obviously, like there's 19th century, 20th century stuff that's clearly obvious that, evangelicalism's changing things and all that. But was there anything else that maybe important that maybe you haven't talked about in other videos? Or just in
Uh,
general? Anything other important? Any other changes that are like really interesting?
well, the important thing is, I think, let's study the New Testament. It
Mm,
turns out that there's an enormous amount of evidence there about 1st century assemblies that I think's been ignored. The one anothering that was taking place, the goal of edifying and building up one another in these assemblies. And if we can just get a glimpse of that and start to apply that to our gatherings today, I think we'll be better off people. Some people have said, Wadsworth, you're just trying to point out how everybody else is wrong and you're the only one who's right. Well, that's not true. My attitude toward getting back to these 1st century activities was to figure out what are we missing? What are we missing
yeah.
by not listening to what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 14?
Mm,
I'm not going to say that if you don't do it the way Paul did it, you're going to go to hell. I'm not saying that. Other people are saying that, but I'm not one of them. And I'm not demanding that it be done this way or that
mm,
everybody else is going to hell because they're not doing it my way
right.
or how I see it. I'm just trying to say, ask the question, what are we missing by not doing it that way?
Mm,
Churches today are suffering. Church attendance is plummeting. It's like this, folks. It's going at a trajectory downward that in the next 50 years, we're going to see massive closures of churches. It's getting down to where churches are starting to get less than 40 and 50 people. And if you look at the heads of those people in the pews, they're all gray. 20 years from now, they're going to be 6 feet under.
mhm.
Something's gone wrong to where people are not going to church anymore. So why don't we crack open the Bible and just say, what are we missing? And I think we're missing a lot. And that's the reason for my
Mm.
7 videos that are on YouTube now.
Yeah, helpful thoughts there. So, just curious as we leave here, do you know when pews were first put in churches?
No, I don't. I think I've probably run across that piece of information, but I don't know. But I think whoever's to blame for that should be shot. I think those are the most uncomfortable things, and they're most inconvenient toward really one anothering. You know, if
Uh,
our gatherings are supposed to be talking to one
yeah,
another and building up one another, a pew is not the way to get that done.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, you're not a church historian. At least it's that that's not what you did your dissertation on. So
True.
that's okay. We'll forgive you for that. But
Thank you.
no, we appreciate the discussion here, and it's been a lot of fun. So people can check out YouTube channel, your number of different videos you've done on this, your dissertation. You're gonna convert that into a book soon, correct? Or eventually?
Yep, working on it. Working
Yeah.
on it, Zach.
And we'll put that in the description eventually whenever that happens. Anything else people should know about?
No, just if some of this stuff intrigues you, I would urge you to go to the videos. That's where the content is. 7 1-hour videos. There's a lot here. And I hit a milestone this week,
Yeah.
Zach. Um, you got to understand, I've never asked anybody to subscribe to my YouTube videos,
Uh-huh.
but this week I hit 10,000 subscribers
Oh man.
without asking for a single one. People are realizing
Woo.
there's something here. And probably by the end of this week, I will have hit 500,000 total views of these videos. So that blows my mind. I
Yeah,
never
pretty
thought
crazy.
this when I started floating them out there. I mean, you float videos out there on YouTube, and you kind of hope maybe we'll get 50 people to watch this. That'd be cool. But now we're up to 500,000. Um,
Yep.
there's people starving all over the world to try to do something with Christianity. I had somebody respond today, just a few hours ago, said, Brother Wadsworth, we need what you're saying in Bangladesh so badly. How can we get the two of you together? I
Mm.
haven't figured out my answer to that question yet, but I'm getting responses from all over the world, Australia, South Africa, England, France, Germany, you name it. 40%, something like that, 40% of the people who are responding are from outside the United States.
Pretty crazy.
So it's crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. All right. Well, we do appreciate the scholar material here, and otherwise, yeah, check out your stuff, everybody. Like and subscribe to his content, and otherwise, I hope you have a good rest of your day, Dr. Wadsworth.
Yeah. Thanks, Zach. Good night.